Good morning. Well, levers and drivers for self-mastery. Today kicks a series on mental rehearsal, often thought of as visualization, but it's much more. Visualization is one of the most misunderstood success principles, in my opinion. It's often misrepresented as something like the universe delivers what you want. People say, I manifested it, and use that as an oversimplified attribution for what actually happened. But in most real world cases, what they're describing is some form of mental, which we'll cover this week. Mental rehearsal, how you prepare your nervous system and your decision making before the moment arrives. You're preparing your network of neurons. Sometimes it's simple. You rehearse a situation enough that when it shows up, it feels familiar instead of threatening. Just how you speak, how you act, and what options you choose or even notice. And sometimes it's far more precise. Rehearsal to train different parts of the stimulus system, especially second, where your systematic reaction before your conscious mind fully engages. This is where what I mean when I talk about automaticity and conditioning the response at the habit level. We are literally, even in the first quarter, during what we think of as reaction time, while the network of neurons are already working, looking for the path of least resistance, responding to or reacting to cognitive, etc. We can condition in chair with mental rehearsal. In practice, for best results, a different form of mental rehearsal is at each of the 7 phases of the 1 second. This is why I created that model. It may seem complex. What I'm going for is simplicity on the other side of complexity. But in order to describe visualization is different, needed a way to do that. And the 7 phases of that 1 second model does just that. When I talk about mental rehearsal, I'm teaching wishful thinking. I'm talking about a practical way or a practical model, how mental rehearsal improves execution, emotional control, and follow through. And that's part of staying regulated, as well as having the response that's aligned with your purpose or quest. This way, you're relying on hope. And as you know, relying on hope can create some anxiety. You start operating with agency. That alone will reduce the feeling that something's going to go wrong. Today, I'll begin with the few simple types of visualization and explain how they work, what their best use is, and why they sometimes fail. Before I jump in on that, I want to something because I think it helps understand what's actually on. So let's say that you're going along, and just imagine this is your life. You're going along in life. There's an upper limit and a lower limit. And you get near the lower limit, you could think of this as money in the bank. You could think of it as how many times you reached out to a loved one. If you reverse them, you could think of this as weight, or you could think of it as or fitness levels. At the lower limit, something happens and you decide, oh, I need to go back to the gym. I need to do this. I need to whatever. When you hit the upper limit, you start getting comfortable and you get a little less, maybe a little less focused on here or that, and then you drop down and through life like this. So for years, this is that habit. 95% of everything we do habit, and then out of nowhere, sign of a crisis happens. When this crisis happens, we we get knocked off we go into fight or flight. We have to work through this. It's ebb and flow. We work things. We're stressed. We're not stressed. We're figuring things out. We don't want to deal with anything. We feel like everything is too much. It's chaos. And sometimes this can be external. And as I talked about last week, some could be from internal load. But then eventually we're going to come out of this. And here's what happens. When we come out, a range. You can come out above where you were, and you can come out below where you were. So we'll call that not the old limit, the new place. What you can have is this same thing continues, but it continues at a lower place. You've lost ground, so to speak. But we still get this same thing happening along. Now, it could get more severe than this. When I was studying people and success pattern, what were some of the consistencies? Because there's been the modeling, which is part of the way to develop this kind of work. I looked at what was common amongst a lot of people who had success. And initially, it looked like most of the people I was looking at, and you could read biographies, etc. You can just read stories about successes. Many of them seem to have lost everything before they made it. At first glance, it almost looks like that's what's necessary. In looking at it, it turns out it's more like they've let go of some things. When you go through this crisis, you have an opportunity to let go of some things. When you go of certain things held dear over here, you're more, and I'm not saying this is the formula, I'm just illustrating something. You're more able to go into level because you don't have the age. Now, to make this plain, you can have limiting beliefs that come from failure or setbacks, and you can have limiting beliefs that come from successes. I know people who won't do anything other than this particular way that's always worked for them. And when you challenge that, they get stressed out. It's almost like a mini phobia response. They imagine living life without doing it that particular way. And the more you do it, the more that becomes the path of least resistance, the more it becomes the way it has to be. There are athletes, professional athletes, and while it may seem like a joke or that it's being spoken of in jest, there is a real thing where people have these superstitions to wear these lucky socks or the lucky headband or whatever it is in order to be successful. As rituals, and I would say that rituals do help because it puts you into state. It's a way of priming. But suppose you have something in your ritual that doesn't help you, that actually becomes a resistance factor rather than an empowerment catalyst. I remember talking to somebody in motorcycle sales, and what I noticed is that they would often ask us, and what other kind of motorcycles they've looked at, which makes sense, but they were asking it, they went to it, and what would happen is the person's mind would get confused and they would start thinking about these other motorcycles instead of one that they were going to buy there. It may be a simple example, but the point is that's an idea that may have gone awry. And sometimes we have that with rules. But here's the one that makes it plain. It's called I don't want power. Now, I don't want power is it goes along with willpower. Here's what's interesting. Willpower comes with, we call it the executive functions, but willpower comes along with the prefrontal cortex. This 20 billion neurons of the 100 billion are in the prefrontal cortex. You probably are familiar with the fact that the prefrontal cortex fully forms between age 19 and 27. So the 20 billion neurons, but they're not developed yet. They're not doing anything. And then they form, and then you've got a prefrontal cortex that's operating between neurons, and it sort of operationalizes all of the habits from the past. So it takes the 0 to 7, the 8 to 15, the 15 to 19, and then what happened in the 20s. and it operationalizes into the model of the world. And this becomes our 95% of life by habit by the time we're age 35. Well, along with the prefrontal cortex comes the things that we don't think we should do. So if you observed something, it turned into be a disaster for the person. That might turn to something, a thought that I'm never going to do that. I use the example of if you have, I'll use my personal example. My mother did not like salespeople coming to the door. And this was in the days they were coming into the door, knife sets and kitchen things and they were hard sell. There was a hard sell. And I remember slamming the door and just like being annoyed, more so because she interrupted, but it just was one of those things that she didn't like. Some people may have that same thing when you get calls from telemarketers. As of observing that, I locked in that salespeople are bad. And then when I started getting interested in business 15 years later, I recognized I got to do something about this sales thing. And at the time, I didn't know, but I ended up in a career in sales and sales operations and sales management. I went deep down the path of sales training, and I did over don't want power, which is what it because I had to do that to make a living and to achieve my the point is this is called I don't want power. And so when you decide, let's say in that example, you take somebody, a typical example like that, and they to decide that they want to, maybe they're going to go into sales training and they shut down in the sales training and they're like, they're just uncomfortable. There are other people who become an entrepreneur, never want to sell. They just say, no, I don't want to sell. And they twist themselves into pretzels trying to get around this need to sell. You have to sell. That's just the way it is. We are, especially now with artificial intelligence, there's going to be, I say, a premium on interpersonal communication, interpersonal exchange, because people want to deal with real people. I think you're going to see live events live in-person events coming back. Big thing before the internet. What happens is when the person thinks about selling, because neurons that fire together wired, and it says selling is bad, that becomes don't want power. I know that, and that's just one example. If you look at a person, when you ask a person, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? And they say this, and this, and then, well, what would failure look like if it happened? And they would say these things, and then you would ask, well, why? And that causes you to think that that's a possibility for you. And you'll hear what the limiting beliefs are. You'll hear, and you may have to ask different questions, but yeah, you get the idea. Hear what their I don't want power is. And it's interesting that people have these different I don't want power. Some of them don't want to do something with LinkedIn, or they don't want to do thing on social media, or they don't want to go live. They don't want to do cold calling, or they don't want to use the phone, or they don't want to sell in person, or they don't want to go door to whatever. And when I was sales manager, I used to bring people out and we'd go door to door. And they would be watching me, and then we'd go in the door and I'd say, you have, and I'll send them in and walk with them and throw them, because I didn't know what I was doing at the time, that I was working with this association thing, but I had to get them past all of the hemming and hawing, and I needed them to be in a safe environment. Them watching me, they felt safe, and then I threw them in, and of course I would save them if something went to get over that hurdle, and that was one way to do it. So on this example, you have the I don't want power can kick a person down here. This I don't want power can also hanging on to baggage. And the old adage, you can't get to second base if you don't leave first. Baseball metaphor. It's the same thing. There are things you have to love to go first to second. You just let go of them, and there are things you have to adopt. And it's worth it. It's important enough that you may want to explore what your I don't want power is. And this gets into the visualization and all that, because when you start visualizing, sometimes we struggle. We may have an I don't want power that's getting in the way, and then you get this cognitive dissonance because you're trying to go forward, but you have something saying going forward is dangerous. So I wanted to lay that out for you just so you have some common language. I think I don't want power is a big cause of people having some obstacles, resistance, unnecessary resistance factors, etc. What I'll do is go through this week is most mental rehearsal, and mental rehearsal is mostly visualization. But there I want to cover visualization, and then tomorrow I'll talk more about deep practice, and that'll be a nice segue into mental rehearsal in general. I am on a quest to help people understand that there is a bright line between law of attraction and what's actually happening. Law of attraction first came about around 1880 to 1880, 1890, so era. 1850 to 1942 was the New Thought era. Was later in towards the end of the 1800s, and it resurfaced. It's been the source of a lot of books, but that's the time when William James, the ecology, was doing his thing. And the reason for the New Thought era, the philosophers were all doing this work, but the printing press came along and it enabled the philosophers to read what other philosophers, and it started spiraling. There's some great books that came out of that. The Game by Florence Shen, the Science of Getting Rich by Wallace Wattles. Obviously, Think and Grow Rich was written in that time. I think Dale Carnegie was as well. And then came along around that. One of the things that's interesting, they all called it a subconscious mind. They didn't have to do the scanning to see that it was a network, of which that didn't really come about until the late 90s in terms of the being available to the public. So even like emotional intelligence, when it was formed and developed, the literature says the personality can't be changed, your intelligence can't be changed, your temperament can't be changed, and all those things are not changed. But they didn't know it at the time because the old model of the world, which was its mind, not a network of neurons. And when you introduce the neurons, you also introduce the topic of myelin, and that's a direct correlation. It's the cause of habits. So a myelinated pathway becomes the path of least resistance, which is where you have a habit. So basically, your habits reside in the network of neurons, not in a mind. So the reason why I don't like relying on things like anything woo-woo, nothing I introduce will be woo-woo. I won't be talking about the universe, and while I recognize manifestation can take on different definitions, problem with that, and I've tried it and I've had successes with it. I remember The Secret was a great book. I used The Secret in developing went for the motorcycle business. And so I've had successes with it. The challenge is it doesn't always work. And number two, it causes a misunderstanding in what you're actually doing. So these things that you learn, visualization, affirmation, whatever it is, auto say something inside of you. But and it worked. But then there's also reasons that it won't when it fails. And when it fails, have this anxiety because you're not sure if it's going to work or not. And so what I say is, yeah, the stuff works until it doesn't. So what I've done is I've developed these models rather than rely on the secret or affirmations or these things. We do it at the source. And then you start realizing why things like having to stop working. They stop working. One is because we just are hit with so much information. We're being bombarded. And the cognitive load is too high for the affirmation to work. That's one reason. The other reason is affirmations tend to go too far. If they go too far, then the mind doesn't believe it, and it's with your network of neurons. That becomes too much cognitive dissonance, and you don't make progress. So now what we'll do is just go through slides We'll go through a few slides and take a look at some of the distinctions around visualization. All right. Quick review: physical, spiritual on the left, emotional in the middle. This is the 7 performance areas. These are the 7 areas that we need to perform and to continue to have these breakthrough results. It's what's needed to live above the line. It's what's that you don't get triggered. The emotional is the gateway to the right side. So it's what we control as well. Emotional. The right side is we need other people. And if you can't manage the left side, if you can't have agency and trip here, you're going to have breakdown here. Self-awareness. This is the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence. I already mentioned that a lot of emotion, 100% support emotional intelligence, but the caveat I have is that the part about being able to change is not accurate. It's been proven that it's not accurate. We can change our personality, our identity. The brain we're born with is not the brain we have to die with because of neuroplasticity. And you can, again, I always say, don't take my Google all of this and go down rabbit holes and come up with your own model of the world around these topics, and you'll come to the same thing because the research is there. It's just sitting in the labs, but it is available to search because there's published papers. So the information is available. It's just not mainstream, and nobody's, for a myriad of reasons. This is the 7-step reset. This is the steps that are involved in a conditioned reaction. Where it happens. This step number 3 is where it all has our battle. This half second is the battle to win every day, and we have to win it thousands of times a day, maybe over 40,000 times a day. Step 1 is the conditioned. Listening to this video or watching this video is part of development, not just the knowledge, so you have to be able to. And that's step 2. Are we showing up as the best version of ourselves? This is like a check-in. Is my coherence? Where's my regulation? Am I regulated? Am I coherent? Because if you're not, you want to reset that very quickly. 33,000 times a day, response cycle every other second, assuming we're awake somewhere around 65,000 seconds a day. And so this step 2, you don't have time. You've got to get back on coherence and regulate. And since you're not fighting a tiger, you have the time to do that. You can take all day to get regulated if you have to. Trust that you think you have, this will be there tomorrow or it'll be gone, right? And then we have step 3, which is as I said, that's the second that we're in the battle. So we get coherent, we're regulated, and then we have step 3, which is the stimulus and the conditioned reaction, which all in a second. And then I separate the reaction, which happens here, from step 4, the response over here. And so I use the seven phases of the 1 second. When I teach this, I do separate it out. I call this the network of neurons, the conscious mind side, to put another step in there. And the reason I do that is because, as I said, visualization, some of the visualization types work best here. Some work here, some work here, some work here, etc. We want to make sure we know where we're working with the person. If I'm working with a client, I can get a sense of where to work, where the breakdown is happening, and then we just ask a couple of questions. What's coming up for you? What made you do that? I watch their facial expressions. You need to do what kind of vision you need or where it's breaking down, and then you decide what kind of vision you need. So this is happening in a half second. This is the part I was talking about. This and this, with this though, right? This is pre-stimulus. Green star is the stimulus, and have this first quarter second. That's reaction time. If you asked me years ago what's happening in reaction, I would have just thought that the network of neurons was kind of slow coming online. No, it's actually working. It's looking at path of least resistance from the cognitive biases. It's not looking at cognitive biases. It's going through the database, but that's where cognitive biases come into play. That's where meta programs, which is essentially a pathway. So if you fire off a set of habits all the time, it turns into a meta program, which becomes a bundle of them, but you have to understand where those are. And again, if you're as a coach, you can see when those are happening, and you have to break it down. This is where the deep practice. This is where we get into talking about identity. But these two phases, you don't even the subconscious is not even aware the a network of neurons, but you can condition it with deep realization. Then you have the reaction formation. This is where it took all of that information, turned it into the reaction, and then pre-conscious surfacing. This is where it hands off to the conscious mind. The It turns that signal into something that can be perceived by the conscious mind. I'll say a thought, but it's not always a thought. It could be an emotion, it could be a feeling, it could be a sensation, it could be an idea. But it doesn't. It's different from what's in the going through the neural pathways. That energy. Now, mental rehearsal. What is it? How it works? There's different types of visualization. I'm going to focus on visualization first because that's what most people think of. Most don't think of 10 different visualization types. You have outcome visualization. The end's pretty straightforward. Process visualization. I'm going to take a screenshot of that. Obstacles. This is coping visualization. It's mental contrasting, looking at what I want versus what I'm getting. This is the wish, outcome, obstacle, plan. What do I want? What's the desired outcome? What are the obstacles? What's my plan to go around those obstacles? Very good. I used to do this in goal setting back in the 80s with Success Motivation Institute and Leadership Management Incorporated. That I was a distributor for that organization, and I would hold workshops with the people who bought the program. And then you have your identity visualization, the being. I'll come back to this one. The best one for when you're designing into the field of infinite possibilities. So last week I talked about this, and I'll talk about it again, how things are changing so rapidly. You have the changing world. You have probably going from unipolar to a multi environment because we've got multiple currencies. Typically, the world superpower and the currency reserve were the same. The world currency were the same. The U.S. dollar, U.S. Around Great Britain, pound sterling. The Dutch, the superpower, the guilder, the the world currency. And now you got BRICS, and you have other countries doing their own gold, mining and processing their own gold. You're going to have problems. It could be two or three, depending on what alliances happen out there. And because we don't know it's a little bit harder to visualize. That's why I talk about above the line. It's harder to visualize what exactly you're going to be doing because it's going to change. But if you know what your purpose is and you know what your passion is, and you can pivot between those two, let me bring my image. If you know what your purpose is and you know what your passion is, you know what your purpose is, you can pivot between your passion to passion, keeping your purpose in sight. So your purpose, you may do a little of this, but you get time to work on your passion by pivoting in between there. You always have you have the context for ideas coming. And when you figure that out, then something that's consistent with that, that's that identity visualization, which we'll talk about again. And future memory, this is visualization living from, this is another one that's got infinite possibilities. You can imagine that there's a result, and then your life as that result comes, whether you're traveling or you have X amount of time, or you're working with this ideal group of people, whatever it is, the outcome of the result is what you're visualizing. Then this is 5, negative visualization, fear, regret, pain of inaction. You have to be careful with this one. It kind of goes with mental contrasting, but a lot of people are doing negative visualization, worrying. In order to worry, you have to think about what you don't want. And when you think about what you don't want, you're creating that can create activated associations. And because the subconscious responds to pictures, and it doesn't have the ability to discern what's right and wrong, it's just going to go after the If you have an emotion packed picture about want, guess what? You're now fighting against yourself. If you've ever seen anyone who wants this, but they don't want it, they want this, they don't want it. That's part of that I don't want kicking in, but also it could be because they visualize so strongly what they don't want. Then you have confident state and state visualization. This is really theology, and that's why I call it mental rehearsal, because it's not always visualization. If you look at Amy Cutter on YouTube, how these power poses, and the Superman pose, different poses actually create testosterone. Now, I did find a study debunked it, but I went through and looked at it. It depends on how you test it and what you're testing. Trust me, we know that physiology can create fight or flight. Physiology can create focus and engagement. And if you use your visualization with physiology, you can actually change muscular. They've seen where pianists change the musculature of their fingers just with visualization, but they're making themselves so strongly going through the motions in their fingers, those neurons. So if you can activate neurons with visualization, you can activate neurons with standing, with physiology. For years, I was trying to figure out why is it that standing, and you could go and look at Tai Chi and Bagua and search the word standing. Martial artists, these especially masters, would stand. They'd stand for an hour in this one position. It's like a fighting stance, but they'd stand for 1 hour, and it would create immense inner strength. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. Why is that so special? Well, guess what? It's actually activating neural pathways, and those neurons are strong. It's such a powerful thing that there's another thread you go down rabbit hole, look at where these people, because sometimes they have kind of weird deaths. It's like, what happened with that? And it blocking the energy, that they're building up so much energy and it's not being released. It's beyond the scope of this, but my point is talking about how just standing is this immense strength. So truly believe what Amy Cutter is talking about, her research around power poses. Something that you can do. I use physiological anchors before I speak, for example. Sensory rich visualization. So this is getting into making the visual stronger. And this is how you improve your reps, because if you don't keep it more exciting and interesting, it could get boring. So you want to keep upping the game. And one of the ways you can do is by adding more detail and adding different aspects of it. You can go through the mental, the physical, the relational, and just do, how's my life different in this group? How's my life different in that group? And then first person visualization is through your own eyes. So third person is observer perspective. This is good when you get some space between yourself and the event. Like when I work with who has a phobia, I would use a watch yourself on the screen. So it's like two steps removed. And then first person visualization is through your own eyes. We'll talk about those in a moment. All right, outcome state works best when it informs conscious engagement post transition. You can take a screenshot. Let me get that out of the way. Outcome visualization, when it never makes it past meaning and into execution. So people get so excited about the visualization, the dopamine happen, patient of the reward or the event, not necessarily making you do the event. It's like the person who just has to go to Starbucks and drink it. It's the anticipation that the dopamine is driving. And sometimes if you visualize in a certain way too much, you kind of like talking about your goals. There's a big argument, right? It's a polarizing topic about your goals. It's better. Some people say don't want to talk about it. And both could be true. I think the harder, the more difficult the goal is when you talk about at least some of that energy, some of that dopamine. And whereas on the other hand of it, if you do talk about it, you create accountability. You have to find what works for you and understand that it's a continuum. The more difficult your goals become, you're going to want to talk about it. Maybe you talk about the on-ramp instead of the actual goal. And then plus you have the external factors as well. You have process visualization is, I think, best for reaction formation. This is getting ready. Sometimes you may be visual you're going to do on the way there. Where it breaks down, process rehearsal fails when the nervous system never gets enough to access it. This could be why visualization fails. And when I'm talking about law of attraction, it works sometimes and then it doesn't. It's not that law of attraction is doing it, it's that the visualization is having an impact on your system in the context of that 1-7 model, the 7 phases. This is breakdown, rapid appraisal, and reaction formation. So remember, I looked at the phases of the 1-second model. This is happening after pre-listening, after initial detection, and it starts, which is just when this network is getting ready to have the react at complete action time. And then we have obstacle and coping. This is the mental contrasting. They call it WOOP, wish, outcome, obstacle, and plan. And where it breaks down, this fails when people rehearse obstacle cognitively, but never rehearse the state, right? So you also have to imagine yourself overcoming that obstacle so it doesn't just become this big obstacle thing. You have to imagine yourself over. It's why some people disagree with the idea that you have to list the obstacles and then come up with the plan. You have to come up with the plan and rehearse the state of going through. This is happening at the pre-conscious surfacing. So remember the 7 phases. This is where the reaction is being handed off to the conscious mind. And then I'm talking about when you're designing in the infinite, the field of infinite possibilities. This is identity visualization. I never knew I was going to be talking about when I first started on this journey. I thought it would be leader as coach, but because I had this picture out there, it wasn't satisfied. This identity visualization has a lot of different ways that it can be used. It influences pre-listening and the initial detection because now you're looking for some. Dispenza talks about show up when you least expect. First, setting the stage for that pre-listening. Many times the thing has always been there. It's just that now you notice it. This is a way of training the reticular activating system with identity visualization. And this is why I tell you that out of the 33,000 response cycles people have, I'm sure I'm less than half of that because I do this identity visualization and I just ignore a lot and I focus on my purpose and then passion to passion, what I'm willing to bit back and forth between. Where at Brown, it fails when it's aspirational instead of behavioral. So that is not just this great thing out there. It's what am I doing? It's seeing yourself in this new role. And if it's infinite possibilities, it's more about how I'm living and the thing, and that you're enjoying the work you're doing and you're associating it with your process. You can't visualize making a sale, for example. And this can also apply to a salesperson. Speaking of sales, they don't know where their sales are going to come from, but they can visualize hitting the numbers at the end of the month, even where the sales are coming from that they're going to come. And here's an issue: the image will run the default response. So, as a coach, if you're working with someone and you see that old default response come up, you know that it's not taken. You have to replace that default response. And what do I mean by the default response? The one under pressure, the one that when ramping up the time, like in deep, as you start making it more intense with progression, when it fails, you watch to see where it fails. If that old self-image still runs the default, some more work. It gets into deep practice, which we'll talk about tomorrow or maybe next week. And then here's the deep practice one: visualization, precision rest. This improves how you do it. You improve the speed, the reliability, the handoff, and what you're doing is getting real precise and in progression, high intention, and intensity bursts. So you may only do it for 5 minutes because it's very, very intense. Where it breaks down, deep practice fails when reps are vague, inconsistent, or emotionally flat. So that's where the intention comes in, precision, complexity. You need struggle at the edge of ability is a big one. You don't beyond your ability. You don't want to be struggling so hard that you're getting stressed. You up to the edge of ability where it keeps aged. And again, it's short periods of time, short bursts. The failure point, as I already mentioned, the system is still generating the same decision. You know you're not there yet. So do the deep practice and say, okay, you do the deep practice and then you test it. You test it by putting the person under load. A good example of this, if you look at professional sports teams, they focus on statistics. There's an opponent in their face every other day, every game. There's an opponent in their face, so they're practicing, and they have a way of measuring whether or not it's working. The thing with leadership, we don't have that. And who's the most persuasive? What's the most comfortable style? What does the boss say to do? We don't have a best practice because there's no system in your face, which is why I use principles. But if you're in leadership development or you have a program, you want to have a way of testing it. And the way to test it is you can actually things. You can innovate and have your leaders, and it's not just simulation, they're actually building something, but it's just not in time of building something to learn the skill and demonstrate the skills. It's the same way that consulting organizations train their people. They put them into scenarios and up the ante while they're they come in at 11 o'clock at night and they're working on a presentation for the next day at 7 a.m. and they tell them it changed, read now. And then the people are up until 4 a.m. instead of going to bed at 11, and they're still working, and sometimes they change it again. So people do enough to present, and they're pressure. In business, we tend to wait until there's something to react to, or you can innovate. And if you get good at innovating, exactly. That's why I go live because I don't have to go live because I run into all sorts of things. Yesterday, I noticed something was wrong because it was very elongated image and I couldn't fix it. And the sound went out as well. So there was something going on with the app way out of my control. In the beginning of going online, I used to use checklists, and I recommend doing that all the time. I don't always recommend it. Don't as I do as I say kind of thing, but you figure it out for yourself. But I use a checklist, and then once I got into the habit of it, I don't use the checklist anymore. But if I do something different, or if I'm doing a course where I've a bigger task, I will use the checklist again. But going live has taught me so much about the reacting to what's happening real time. And not only that, I am activating every time I'm speaking, I'm activating systems, and my system will surface where there's a disconnect. One of the reasons I like using SIN is because I can keep 7 chunks of information in mind. I have 7-step reset, 7 phases of the 1-second model. I have 7 factors of neural pathway activation. I have 7 performance series because I can hold 7 to 9 information in my brain at a time. So I have 7 plus the 2 extra chunks. And that way I can constantly be mapping to make sure in MECE, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. By using 7s, I'm more able to reach, because either I have to add some things or add a new model. If I'm too big, I have to add a new model, for example. All right. Mental rehearsal, what it is, how people call it, the oversimplified attribution. I manifested it. It's really preparation and priming. Most of the time, the universe brought it to me. For me, reduces the threat, so I pick it up, like Joe just said, when you least expect it, but you're already expecting it. So it's not a threat. It's something you pick up. It just happened. It's become visible because your reticular activating system is now looking for them. They've always been there, but now I got lucky. Improved state relation under pressure. When you're under pressure, you're narrow. Your focus have fewer options available. When you're regulated, your vision is pushed out, and you're able to see things that are there. Rehearsal talked about this a bit. So you have you have channels, which is visual, emotional, and linguistic, self-explanatory. You have strategies, implementation intentions, and mental contrasting of strategies. And then you have methods, how it's encoded and trained. This is deep practice. We'll have to talk more about that one. And so here's more in visualization. Most manifestation is preparation, priming, and better responses under pressure. Not magic, not just vague. You're actually doing what I'm talking about in the 7-step reset and the 7 phases the 1 second model. You're leveraging that because that's the automaticity. And because it's happened 11 million bits per second on the network of neurons side, they can't understand it. And because it's always been called a mind, it's completely separate. It doesn't make sense. But once you recognize, okay, it's 11 million bits per second, and that processing gets handed off to the conscious mind, which only processes 50 bits per second, and there's a filter process that happens naturally. If I visualize different things, I'm going to filter different things. And as I filter those different things, I'm going to have new opportunities. You still have to go through the door. So I talk about this work will identify the door. It'll even open the door, but you still the door. This is another place where people fail. Uh, and visualization won't work if you don't go door, so to speak. And then there's two modes. And this is different. It's even different how you use the mode. So there's third person simulation. This is what I was talking about. Watch yourself is like having the observer, and this gets you some space, especially if it's triggering. Phobias is you double dissociated, watching yourself watch yourself on the screen, because then the person is not being triggered. When I work with person to uncover their limiting beliefs, I use that same movie theater technique because I don't want their neural pathways firing off what the belief is. I want to have a neutral conversation. Associated, this is first person simulation used when you need courage, execution, first person. So when we talk about the swish pattern, which I'll get, that works very early in that network of neurons side. It's actually happening in the first quarter of a second before the time. And if you think about changing, if you wait until the conscious mind is aware, there's no way. If you don't even on in the first quarter of a second, that's called reaction time. Imagine you have no chance of doing it if you wait till the conscious mind. So we actually change things inside that quarter of a second because we know what's going on. Between associated and associated, it's first you regulate. So think about dissociated to getting back, and then associated is how you install. And if you add breathing here, that's a big empowerment catalyst is breathing, especially if you can anchor the breathing. And then what we want to do is stay here, regulated. You're doing your step 2 coherence and regulation, and then you're doing your return to mindfulness, and now you're the next one. This is happening thousands of times. You have time to wait, but we want to stop this from becoming this. We don't want it to be stacked where your reaction is your stimulus and the reaction is the stimulus, and you have no response, emotional modulation, or action. And I talked about the crisis. This is similar. One of the that makes it very difficult to rise above our norm where we are is that we have this barrier above us, cognitive dissonance. And this turns most people going through it. And then all these memories, these things get triggered, which is why you have to have the regulation, you have to have the agency, you have personal leadership. Bad experience can trigger things, but so can good experiences, as I was talking about with I don't want power. Maybe getting cheated, things your teacher said, and it can stop you. And you just keep going back, and then the person just accepts it's not for me. Be aware that going through this will be tremendous cognitive dissonance. And then the other difficulty is that anxiety, excitement have the same energy signature, same neural pathway kind of energy signature. So it can be perceived as anxiety, and you're excited about, but then anxiety kicks in, and you start wondering when the next shoe is going to drop. And so this makes it very difficult as a coach. This, and when it happens, I call it out. I say that's what you're going. Right now, it's cognitive dissonance. Guess what way to handle the cognitive dissonance is forget about it, go to bed. Your brain does the neuroplasticity work at night. You may have heard this. The brain gets rid of all the gunky stuff, and it learns the new encode. It does the new encoding. Like when you do that happens overnight. It happens during the day as well, but clearly we're sleeping. You get this and that, and you'll wake up the next day with ideally sometimes go from I'm scared, I don't know what's going to happen, to I have to get going, and we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do that. The neuroplasticity kicked in, the old beliefs are gone. That belief can't do this is not available for me. Once that belief falls, you start making more progress, but you still have this can be 6 months. This is what Joe talks about. A similar idea. He says crossing the river. Crossing the river, you still have to jump in swim and go through it and get to the other side. Once you're at the other side, it's different. But some people come back down just because even up here, now you're in infinite possibilities, and it could become scary because you don't know where the next stimulus is going to come from. And that's right thing here. This is the unfamiliar and the unknown. So we have to switch from using our conditioned behavior for the upper limit and the lower limit, and we have to convert that to our books where there was a tremendous amount of research. And then we have the mental rehearsal for above the line. Opportunity threats are what's up there, the unfamiliar and the unknown. And I go live. You can find some of these past events on the channel you're watching right now. Go YouTube. I go live every day, Monday to Friday. And on Friday, I do the live event on LinkedIn. And usually it'll be a sub of what I talked about during the week. So, like today, I'm talking about visualization. Tomorrow, I'll be talking about deep practice. I'll talk about swish patterns and some other things probably on Thursday. And then I'll summarize those on Friday. So they'll roll into a summary on Friday on LinkedIn. And then on the 12th of February, I have a full workshop, the 4 Self-Mastery. So you'll learn a little bit more of what I'm talking about, but it's more about the practice. It's more about ingraining it. We're going to start with your quest. You'll come a quest. So now we're applying principles to something you're actually working on. It's not just an idea or some theory. We're actually going to work on it. You'll walk away with it. You have, and it's an editable PDF. So you'll be able to save it under a different name, and you have that same editable PDF to use again and again, or to use with other quests. A great project template. It's an innovation template. It takes you from idea to action, and we'll use that, work through it. And what we'll do in that workshop, stay on easy things. We want to break the learning into 2 steps. Steps, or doing the actions, and then apply to stuff. Too often people want to try the hardest thing to have, and it's a new skill. No, first we have to lock the skill. The same way in special ops and martial arts, they train the thing first, bits and pieces in this environment. You don't start off learning to break bricks before you've learned how to follow through with a punch or a kick. So you have, and in tournaments until you are with somebody in your own school, etc. Just examples. So we have to learn this first, and then we apply the real world stuff. So that was a lot. I wanted to go through that on the visualization. Hopefully, you've seen how visualization is really, it has a lot of power, and it's a great tool and resource. And what leads to what people call manifestation, there's 11 million bits of information being processed that you're not aware of, and the visualization makes you aware of it, as does other things. So there you go. If you have questions, and we will go going along this